Do the religious have good reasons to believe in God? Well, of course not. We'll get that one right out of the way. Today, we're going to see an example of why it's so hard to find intelligent theists, or at least theists who are intelligent when it comes to their faith. Because these people are just running on pure emotion and child abuse. And whether they like it or not, that's not a good thing. Today, we're going to take a look at a small part of a debate between Alex O'Connor and Bishop Robert Barron that was held over on Justin Brierly's channel. While the whole debate is worth looking at, just to show you just how weak Barron actually is, I thought this segment was worth going after on its own. It shows just how irrational the religious actually are when it comes to evaluating their own beliefs. This is why it's so hard to have a decent conversation, because these people don't believe anything for good reasons. Now, I'll throw in some of my own experiences along the way, just as a contrast, but we'll get to that when we get there. So, let's go see why Barron is a bishop and why none of it is at all impressive.
I was born and raised a Catholic, so from a devout Catholic family, went to Mass every Sunday, was sent to Catholic schools from the time I was 6 years old. And so, I took Catholicism pretty much for granted as a young man.
Which is the insidious nature of childhood indoctrination. It's why religions around the world do it. If you can get your beliefs latched onto a young child, especially from before they can form rational thoughts and intellectually evaluate them, it's insanely difficult to rip those beliefs away. Of course, I've talked about the evils of childhood indoctrination before, how it's ultimately child abuse to take ideas that are indefensible and force them on an innocent child, but the religious, they don't care about that, do they? They just want to get their pound of flesh. They aren't concerned at all with the damage that they're actually doing. And if you talk to most atheists, most new atheists, you find just how much they're struggling with this insidious brain poison. But let's get back to Bishop Barron.
I wasn't all that interested in religion as a kid. I was interested in sports. I liked to read, but I read books about baseball players and basketball players. And I wanted to be a baseball player. So the rest of my life as a kid was about sports. My Catholicism was sort of taken for granted as a background of my life.
Which it shouldn't have been. You accepted it uncritically, and you still do. This is the kind of story that I hear all the time from the religious, that their beliefs became an unquestioned part of how they viewed reality and how they viewed themselves. Of course there's a God. How could anyone say there isn't a God? And when you see theists today assuming that everyone is just like they are, and how could the world be any different than the way that they see it? And how could anyone doubt the existence of their imaginary friend? A lot of that goes right back to the evils of childhood indoctrination, where people ought to be asking themselves if this is true, using all of the methodology of intellect and rational skepticism. They are being kept from doing so by a quirk of human development, and religious beliefs are taking advantage of that. Because that's really where religion gets their power. Because if they didn't do that, there wouldn't be so many of them. They are screwing over innocent children because they want more members. They're just taking advantage of people.
But a major, I say it now as a grace in my life, occurred when I was about 14. So I was my first year in high school, do you say what, secondary school, and I went to a Catholic high school, And this young Dominican friar presented one of Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. Well, I didn't doubt God's existence. I wasn't like a modern rationalist wondering whether God exists.
And that's the problem. I think it's funny watching the religious blunder around, proving that they've got significant intellectual problems and thinking absolutely nothing of it. Of course you had no doubts in the existence of God, any more than Hindus have any doubts in the existence of Krishna. The one thing I'm willing to bet he's never done is actually take a skeptical position to the existence of God. Oh, he might claim to have done so, I've got no idea, but most theists simply never do. I think that when I was a bit older than he was, I was willing to actually look at the facts regarding Christianity, not just what had been handed down to me from the pulpit. And that was essential in my choice to walk away from religion. I cared more about the facts than I cared about my childhood indoctrination. Not a lot of theists can say that honestly.
And I'm sure that presentation bored every kid in the room, but I don't know why to this day. I think it's kind of a grace. It just fascinated me that you could think about God in a more serious way.
Yeah, sorry, I don't buy it. Because if you were going to think about God in a serious way, you'd have to address all of the failings of Catholicism. And there are many, 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 many. Yet I'm willing to bet Barron here didn't actually question a lot of the things that he'd been told over the years. He didn't go out and try to verify any of the things in the Bible scientifically. He didn't ask why the Bible is stuffed full of clear and obvious contradictions. He didn't ask himself why his church was trying to cover it all up with bald rationalizations and made-up explanations. And he definitely didn't ask himself why his church was covering up many, many, many hundreds of years of childhood pedophilia. Nope, he just believed. I've talked to a lot of people about this over the years, both theists and ex-theists, and again, I think a lot of this goes back to childhood indoctrination and good old-fashioned religious stubbornness. The sunk cost fallacy is a major factor in religion, especially once the theist gets to the point where their beliefs seem absurd, but they can't admit that they spent so many years believing complete nonsense. That's been an observation of mine for a very long time, that there's a certain point where if you back the theist into a corner, they're just going to come out swinging or just run away because they can't handle the logical implications of the fact that they've wasted their life. It causes too much emotional pain. But let's let him continue.
Mind you, too, I'm coming of age in the years right after Vatican II, which was, to say the least, not a high-water mark of Catholic education. So the schooling I got in Catholic school was what I call the banners and balloons Catholicism. It was a lot of making collages, a lot of personal experience, very low-level doctrinal presentation. So I never thought of religion as a serious topic.
I mean, it's really not. There are certainly a lot of people who take it seriously, but when you really get down to it, it's like talking to rabid Potterheads, the people who really get into Harry Potter. The ones that have read the books a dozen times, they're out there writing fanfic, they're dressing up and going to Harry Potter-themed conventions, and walking around with wands doing swish and flick. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, so long as you can recognize the difference between the fantasy and the reality. But there are some people who can't. They simply don't know any better. And this, I think, is religion in a nutshell. It's a bunch of people taking a book way too seriously and not being able to tell that this is just a book. It's not like the books aren't okay, I guess, at least at the beginning, and there are some decent enough lessons that you can take from them. But holy crap, it's not something to model your entire life around, and that goes for both the Bible and Harry Potter. And I wish people could figure that out.
There was English and history and math and science were the serious topics, and then religion was like gym class or something. It was something we did in school, but it wasn't really intellectually serious.
I guess I was just more intellectually serious about it than he was back in the day. I went to all religious schools right up until college, and we had daily religion classes too, taught by one of the on-campus pastors. I was actually kind of fascinated by the whole thing, to be honest, as much as with any other subject, which is likely one of the reasons I had considered and thankfully rejected the idea of going into the ministry in some fashion. I've had people ask me how serious I was about it, and honestly, at least in retrospect, I don't know that I can really be that certain. It was just an idea I entertained. I didn't really feel that I'd been called by God or anything like that, but that I could share my faith and make a difference in the world, and I think that's kind of what attracted me to it. It wasn't really a fully formed idea. I didn't have visions of leading my own congregation or anything like that, but by the time that any of it might have come to fruition, I'd largely rejected the idea of Christianity as stupid and ludicrous. And that took a lot of time, to be honest. Getting rid of that indoctrination, it was a lot of work, and it's something that no one should have to go through.
Well, that presentation in high school was the first time I came across something like an intellectually interesting presentation of the faith. Well, it lit a fire in me, and I went to the local library. I'm 14, and I don't know if you know Mortimer Adler's series of the great books. It was very popular in our country, and it's all the great thinkers of Western civilization. And there were 2 volumes on Aquinas, and so I saw those. I grabbed one, and I brought it home. And I didn't know what I was reading. I had no preparation whatsoever to read that sort of text. But it started a process in me that's never really stopped from that time.
And maybe that's because you weren't prepared for it. See, at the time, I was also going to the library in an attempt to verify my faith. I'd already figured out that some parts of the Bible were complete nonsense, like the flood story and the creation myths, and I was trying to dig deeper. I think that was probably the difference between you and me. I had already experienced the disappointment that Christianity, as I'd been taught it, wasn't quite true, and I was looking for the truth. Barron, I'm sure, was just looking to verify the things that he already believed. He was looking for reasons that he should keep believing, and I was looking for reasons to think that any of it was true. There just wasn't any, which is why I fell away. While he was only cherry-picking the data, reading books on Christian apologetics and the like from the perspective of Christianity, which led him to thinking that his faith was still valid, I wasn't doing that. I was reading lots of books by a wide variety of authors and a wide variety of perspectives, looking only at the evidence. You can't be afraid to read everything and step outside of your comfort zone, and I don't think the religious are willing to do that most of the time. There's something that we call the religious who go on a legitimate quest for knowledge. We call them atheists.
And it convinced me that it was worthwhile thinking about religion. And I think, as Alex just said, I quite agree with that if this is right, what this man is arguing, there's nothing more important. And that started me on a process. So I never really left the church or had questions about it, but this moment was a moment of deepening. And heck, it followed me my whole life. I mean, I got into eventually the priesthood, but then more specifically into study, doctoral work, and then my own teaching and writing. So it set me on a trajectory away from baseball and toward, the intellectual exploration of the faith.
Yeah, I don't buy it. Oh, I'm sure he thinks that's the case, but I'm sure he's only paid attention to the things that support and validate his beliefs instead of just going after the actual reality underlying it all. When you start with faith as your baseline, as everything he said proves that he's done, then it's no wonder you stay with the faith that you started with. It's only when you start asking if the faith is warranted to begin with, and then go looking to verify the very nature of the things that you believe, that's when the whole house of cards starts to fall apart. It's why when you start to look at a lot of the things these apologists and lifelong believers say, you don't find people who have ever really questioned their faith. They've never really been able to say, well, what if I'm wrong? They can't look at the Bible or the Quran or any other holy book, set aside how they feel about it, and just go through it step by step, comparing what it says to objective reality, evidence by evidence, page by page. They can't do that because they don't care if any of it is demonstrably true. They can't put away their faith and just operate on intellect. It's why most of them never get anywhere useful.
So that's kind of a quick version of my story.
And it's just not impressive, at least not to me. It's really not much different from many others that I've heard from, and the common factor with all of them is not asking the right or really any questions at all. It's just, I believe. And that's as deeply as any of these people tend to go. Now, I'm not a fan of Robert Barron. I've done a couple of his videos over the years, and I've never been impressed at all. Granted, I can't think of a single apologist I've ever really looked at that I've been impressed with, so that's not really saying a lot, but yeah, he's not one of my favorites. I think the difference between people like Barron and people like me is the capacity to turn off the blind faith and look at reality unaided. If you can stop believing for emotional reasons and just go into it purely intellectually, religion simply cannot survive. Every time I talk to a theist about why they believe, they always have emotional reasons, as though that proves anything. They can't point to the data. They can't just say, here's the evidence that convinced me, because it's never evidence that got them there in the first place. They've never actually asked themselves if the things that they believe on faith, the things that it says in their silly book, they've never tried to find out if those things actually stand up to intellectual scrutiny. Mostly because they don't. There's always a double standard at play. There's something we would use to examine everything else in the world, and then there's the softball criteria they use for their own books. Because they've been brainwashed, usually in early childhood, to think that this is unquestionably true. And that's not how rational, intelligent people work. It's why childhood indoctrination is just child abuse. And that's why they do it. Because it works for their purposes. Their purposes are just evil, whether they're willing to admit it or not. So anyway, what did you think? Do you think that I ought to look at more Bishop Barron videos? He's really nothing special in my opinion, but he's one of the more vocal out there, so, it's cannon fodder. What do you want? I'm happy to go wherever my viewers want me to go, so let me know. Plus, what do you think of his story? Would that convince you of anything worthwhile in his beliefs? I'm not expecting to get a lot of positive responses for that one because these are not rational people and their conclusions are not well conceived. But these are people with imaginary friends, so really what can you expect? Anyway, until next time, stay rational, and I'll catch you all in the next video.
Boom, dicky, 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 boom.